Time and again, we have been negligent of the effects as we are very keen on focusing on what we have in the present rather than worrying about whether we'll have it in future or not, or whether our future generations will have it. Now, one such aspect that is seen as the worst affected and often the most underrated problem is actually of women. Now, we have gathered here to, in fact, address this entire problem and have, kind of our experiences and understand that why is it such an issue with a moderated panel discussion on women empowerment as a key to sustainable development. And gender inequality is most persistent and pervasive global problem of 21st century, militating against the attainment of sustainable development in patriarchal society. And several forums have noted that the centrality of gender equality and concerns of women empowerment to the achievement of sustainable development. And we have all gathered here to address this issue in more depth. So let me quickly welcome Ms. Madhubala Nath, a pathfinder and a renowned gender specialist who started her career in the early 80s as a women development officer with the Swedish International Development Authority in India, called SIDA. She moved on to working at the policy level with the United Nations Development Fund for Women as its regional director for India and Indochina. In 1994, she started working on HIV/AIDS with the UNDP and later with UNAIDS as its regional policy advisor. In the new millennium, she has worked with UN Women in South Asia.
I think her connection just dropped, isn't it?
Yeah.
Maybe somebody else can take over then.
Yeah. Can we have Ms. Madhubala Nath for the keynote? Can I invite you, please, ma'am?
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll begin with warm greetings to my friends and colleagues assembled here to reinforce their commitment to women's empowerment and sustainable development. It's wonderful to be with minds who think alike. Today, there is enough data that shows that unless it is people-centered. What do we mean by people-centered? We've heard the words people-centered, human development. And about 2 decades ago, Mahbubul Haq, in his human development reports, brought in the whole concept of human development, and he compared countries, whether it was, he compared Sri Lanka and he compared Saudi Arabia. Sri Lanka didn't have a very high per capita income, but you saw life expectancy, you saw school enrollment ratios. They were much better than Saudi Arabia, which had a much higher per capita income. And he sort of built the discussion and the argument that this is people-centered development, where the wealth gets translated into people's well-being. Similarly, around the same time or slightly later, Dr. Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum brought in the whole concept of capability poverty. And they said that 64% of a nation's wealth is because of its human potential, human capacities. The word used was capability poverty. And so 64% was because of its people's capacities. About 16% was due to its per capita income and economic growth. And the remaining 20% lay in physical wealth like forests, minerals, ocean resources, and so on and so on. The fact remains that building human capacity was fundamental, and it has been established through data by scholars, world economists, whatever. And this is where women's empowerment falls barely and squarely. Because when we are building human capacities, we all know that women lack capacities more than men. There is enough data on that also. And without focusing on women's empowerment, we cannot really talk of development or sustainable development. So the argument is very, very clear. Now, as we think of women's empowerment, there are 3 or 4 aspects of the empowerment that we have to keep in mind. And that is that it is about enlarging women's choices, number 1. Number 2, they have to have access to development resources so that they can, and very important, this third part, develop their full potential. And that is what creates that 64% of human capacities that make a nation's wealth. So let us now look quickly into what happens when you don't do this. And I'm going to give you examples from various parts of the world. I have a number of examples, but with the shortage of time, I'm going to cut short a few examples. But I'll begin with agriculture in India. Now, agriculture, as we all know, employs close to 70% of all economically active women, and they contribute 66% of the work on farms. And there are varying statistics, but by and large, you get an idea of the enormity of their participation in agriculture. Now, we've all heard of the training and visit system, the TNV system, that reaches out training and capacity building, and we are talking of capacities, to women in agriculture. Number 1, for years we found that there were very few women in the training and visit system, largely made up of men. And what was even more surprising was that in Kerala, one of the most advanced states, as far as education is concerned, women's empowerment is concerned, we found that even the women extension workers under the TNV system were reaching out to men. Because the stereotype is that men own the farms and women are invisible. The same thing happened, so there was hardly any training reaching the women. The same thing happened in the area of animal husbandry and dairying. India has about 75 million as against 1.5 million men in dairying. And when you look at IRDP loans, that was the program earlier for creating assets for women and men for rural development, integrated rural development program. We found at that time that only 15% of the loans had gone to dairying, where large numbers of women predominated. So asset create, and only 1% of the women were part of cooperatives set up under dairy. So you see the whole concept of asset creation did not reach women. What did it mean in terms of its impact? Even today, and there's enough data which I have with me, it'll be too much to share at this juncture. Agriculture remains a depressed sector in India. It employs the largest number of people and it is the depressed sector. It contributes only 18% to the GDP. And we've achieved food sufficiency in production, only in production. But India still accounts for a quarter of the world's hungry people and is home to over 190 million undernourished people. Do you see the impact? By just not engaging women. This is the kind of impact it can have. So empowering women with assets and capacities is fundamental for sustainable development. Similar data we found from Ethiopia, where only 11% women in agriculture, which is again an agriculture dominant country, only 11% women in agriculture had been able to avail of extension services. And the list goes on. And just incidentally, under COVID, a recent study done in India and Nepal has shown that 50% of women in India and Nepal have reduced access or no access to services. So just imagine, multiply the impact of what could happen if we don't sit up and act. Let me now quickly take you to the issues of health and SRHR, sexual and reproductive health. Health is such an important area for sustainable development because human capacities can be built when people are healthy. Today, there is enough empirical evidence to show that sexual and reproductive health is directly correlated to gender-based violence. I mean, all of us here would be knowing this, and I don't have to go further, but I'll just give you some data just to elucidate the point. In Zimbabwe, we'll go to another country now. In Zimbabwe, 26% of ever married women are forced to have sex when they do not want it, right? And this kind of data we can get for every country. But the prevalence of STIs in Zimbabwe amongst women is as high as 39%, right? Why? The men who use force to obtain sex at home were found to be more likely to report extramarital affairs and sexually transmitted infections, right? And I'll give you some data from the US very recently. What is the impact on it on sustainable development? A press release dated January 2021 by CDC in the US has reported that in 2018, there were 68 million new infections of STIs in the US, and that 1 in every 5 persons has an STI. The direct annual medical costs of STIs in America total to $16 billion. I mean, look at the size of the problem. Again, let's look a bit at family planning, which is part of SRHR. And way back, when India was trying to have forced sterilizations to reach family planning to every nook and corner in the villages, by that time, the World Bank had a data that clearly showed that contraception accounts for only 15% of the decline in birth rates. 25% comes from economic growth and 60% comes from women's empowerment. So you can see the impact on sustainable development when we are talking of health. Let me now quickly bring you into just one sentence on COVID here, that we did a study recently in India, and violence, gender-based violence has increased a lot under lockdowns. And you can correlate it to a possible impact and the need and the urgency to look at women's empowerment initiatives. I'll talk a little bit about value of time and wages. First, when the labor market values of women's time is relatively low, women will be in charge of child rearing and domestic work in the family, by and large. The opportunity costs are limited. And so the low value of female time means that children direct correlation to high fertility. So gender and empowerment is so fundamental, and because of low value of wages of women in the market, see the impact on sustainable development. And find that investing in education and skill development of girls will not get them too much ahead. They invest relatively less in education and skill building. And what amazed me was an ILO report that has recently been brought out. The impact of, if they had invested in girls' education, what would it have meant to the economies? I'll just read it out. It's called the economic impact of reducing the gender gap. And it states that closing the gender gap in labor participation by 2025 could increase global GDP by $5.3 trillion. This is an ILO report that has just come out. So investing in women is, it cannot be questioned at any forum, but somehow it is not happening. I'll now just, in fact, the ILO report says that SDG 1, SDG 5, SDG 8, one on poverty, one on gender, and one on employment cannot be achieved unless investment in women's empowerment is done. Do I have a little bit more time, or do I need to stop here?
Ms. Nath, I think we have got a lot of data here and we are a little close on time. So I'll start with my first question with you with just exactly what you stated right now. We want to understand and we want to let the audience understand a little more depth by going into a little more depth as to why, as you correctly said, gender equality is the key to sustainable development. And in fact, critical for the success of all the SDGs, the ones that you just listed. And apart from that, also, it's considered very critical for their development. I would request you to please elaborate on that a little bit for us today.
Yeah. It is important for sustainable development because about this, that human development cannot be achieved without investing in human capacities. And capability poverty is something that prevents. So that is why investing in women's empowerment is fundamental. Every sector has to invest, whether it is health, whether it is agriculture. I would like to, do you have another question, or should I just, I wanted to say one other thing that relates to this question.
Sure, Ms. Nath. Sure, please.
Why do you think we did not invest? I think that is emerging very clearly.
True.
I think what is happening is that somehow we built our whole development programming on certain assumptions. And I list out some of those assumptions for you. And this part of this discussion, I would want to call learning to unlearn. And I'll go deeper into this now. The assumptions were, for example, that the household is well suited to be the basic unit for program delivery. The reality of the intra-household disparities, especially around gender, had been ignored in most of our development programs. All government programs go through a household and the head of the household, even today. Number two, another assumption was that adolescents, especially girls, had no need for sexual expression at all. Marriage and all kinds of sexual health initiatives were. So those kinds of things became a barrier to gender. A third thing was that the patriarchal dividend, that because of the patriarchal dividend, men do not need targeted programs to revisit their masculinity issues. It was fundamental. But women's empowerment was not seen as part of demystifying the patriarchal dividend. And the other thing was that we thought that the elimination of economic poverty will eliminate all other kinds of poverty. The gender poverty and its dimensions were not fully understood. Dr. Amartya Sen has brought out that there are 19 kinds of poverty that need to be eliminated. So I think these are the kinds of assumptions that we have to unlearn as we go forward if you're looking at sustainable development, as we empower women.
Very true, Ms. Nath. I think it's all deeply embedded in most of the cultures all across the globe, which gets me to my second question. How do you think that such beliefs and such value systems that actually promote gender inequality can be challenged?
I think that's why I mentioned that phrase, learning to unlearn. When we were working on HIV and AIDS, we found so many myths around sexuality. And I will share one with you. We were working with truck drivers in India. They were supposed to be taking the HIV virus from one place to the other. And they were stigmatized and all of that. And there was a lot of work done under projects to support the fact that the awareness of truck drivers gets improved. Now, suddenly we found after 2 years of work that excellent data showing that so many condoms distributed, so many meetings held, so many truck drivers trained and whatnot. I went and sat at a dhaba, at a roadside cafe, and I watched the trucks come in where they wait, they rest, and they move on. And at that time, in the 90s, they used to open the bonnets of their trucks for letting the engine cool down. And when I potted around, waiting for them to have their bath and come out, get ready for a workshop, I noticed there were lots of condoms around the radiators of those trucks. So I asked, why are these condoms here? And they, oh, they form wonderful leak-proof material for our trucks and all. I said, but were you trained in something different about HIV and the use of condoms? And you know what they said? They said, this is all new learning. But our parents, our fathers, our grandfathers have taught us that every 400 kilometers when you drive, get out of the truck and have sex. Otherwise, you'll have an accident due to the heat generated in your body. Now, this is the unlearning that was needed before we did all the workshops. But we understood it much later. And I think this is what I'm implying, that a lot of work before starting a project has to be done on the myths around gender and sexuality. Only then can we address it.
Very true, Ms. Nath. And truly to mainstream the involvement of women and girls in sustainable development, it demands a change in attitudes and behavior towards women and girls all across the, at all levels. Now, it has also got a very deeper connection with the standard of living and the quality of life, for which maintaining high and stable levels of economic growth is imperative, and especially to sustainable development. So, around this, I have my next question, which is what changes, in fact, can be foreseen in the quality and quantity of economic development with the participation of women?
See, I think there are two things we have to keep in mind here. One is what happens when the condition of women improves, right? Condition of women is about, survival indicators, life expectancy, maternal mortality, wages received. They get more money in, they invest it in their children. And, we've heard a lot of this. And these are called survival indicators. But the real change happens when the position of women also changes with our interventions. And what happens when the position changes? Number one, their visibility increases. Right? What does visibility increase means? That they become members of strong movements. So their voices are carried far and to the highest, the advocacy part becomes amazing. The second thing that happens with when their position changes is that the social distance between the woman and say any kind of a service provider changes. In a lot of countries, we found when a woman has to report STI, she talks to the doctor saying, I have a backache and I feel weak. Because her self-esteem is so low, she doesn't talk about a lot of these things. She's considered a bad woman if she talks about it. But the moment her position changes, she gets the self-esteem and the power to be able to go to a service provider and say, look, I'm having a discharge from my vagina. You know, that kind of a control over information and the fact that it is nothing wrong in something like this. So with all of this, the condition and the position, and also you'll find that freedom indicators start showing a change. You'll find that women won't need permission to go to a health center or to go for a meeting. Here, a lot of them don't even get access to some of these possibilities. Then there is the kind of decisions they take changes completely. The way a woman will spend her income in the house will be very different from the way a man will spend it. And the moment she's part of cooperatives, you will find that a man stops drinking in the house. Our good old Arak movement, anti-Arak movement and all is proof of all of that, or the movement in the hills in India. So I think it will be then it becomes much easier to measure equality. And you'll suddenly find you'll have a lot of strong women coming on television, being depicted in serials and all. And I think those are the changes that we're looking forward to as these women escalate the whole issue to a higher level of sustainable development. Have I answered your question?
Absolutely, Ms. Nath. I think we have a good amount of knowledge here, and especially coming from you. Will, I have a small research here that was actually done in Mongolia by Asian Development Bank that estimated that eliminating gender inequalities in the labor market could actually add up to 16.1% to GDP over the next 30 years. You know, like you quoted, for all the many other countries, it does make an impact to the GDP, right? And you know, so to address this, you know, now is a very good time to rethink. As you said, you know, you have to unlearn and then learn. So now is a very good time to rethink and reanalyze, as we are in the process of starting again, especially after the pandemic. We have to start again. So to address this, let me also welcome Dr. Olusola, who is Malaria's Consortium's Country Technical Coordinator in Nigeria. She provided technical oversight and support to all the programs in the country, and this includes the DFID-funded SUN-MAP 2. Dr. Olusola has been presenting on an assessment of quality of delivery of seasonal malaria chemo prevention using low literate community health workers in Nigeria, and examining the feasibility of community health workers' delivery of severe acute malnutrition treatment during an innovative, simplified, low literacy protocol in Nigeria. Very welcome to you, Dr. Olusola.
Thank you very much, Rekita. So great to be here. Very honored to be here.
Pleasure is all ours. Dr. Olusola, I will just come up with the first question that I have for you. With your expertise and with your experience, please make us understand as to what are the most critical changes that our governments, and in fact, all over the world, and policymakers must make in order to face the future effectively in terms of the role of women in environment and climate change.
Thank you very much again, Rekita, and it's quite an honor to be on this call, and great to meet Madhubala Nath. It's an honor to meet you, and thank you for the great work that you've been doing, and also to thank the organizers of this conference. I think this is massive. This is really timely. It's something that is quite needed at this time. And I think, I mean, just to answer your question about what the government needs to do, I think, first of all, we need to start with looking at how does climate change actually affect women? Because if we have that understanding from that perspective, then we would be able to really articulate what changes need to be made in order for us to face the future more effectively. So first of all, I mean, we know that when effects of climate change happen, floods, you know, all the effects of weather changes and all that, the most vulnerable, the most affected usually are the women and the girls. There's displacement, people are displaced from their homes, they are moved into camps, and when they go into camps, there's every possibility of increased risk of violence against women and violence against girls in those camps. They are open up, they are vulnerable to all sorts of stuff. There's lack of food. And we all know that mothers are the homemakers. They are the ones that are responsible for gathering food, for producing food for the family. They are the ones that go around to gather, get water and everything that is needed for the family to survive. Now, climate change makes these tasks even more difficult for women. Yeah, because it becomes really much more difficult when there is drought. They have to travel more distance to get to where they can get water for the family. And, they face all sorts of things that, that make them vulnerable, and even more vulnerable, much more than they were before the climatic conditions change. Now, we know that when environmental changes happen, it impacts more on the people who depend on natural resources to survive. And we know that women really depend on natural resources to survive. Madam Nath just told us that, more than 70% of women who are employed in the agri sector. And so they're like closer to nature. And so when you have a disruption in nature, they are most affected. And weather conditions, climatic changes affect the poor in the world. And we know that more than 70% of the poor in the world are also women. And so they are usually at the receiving end of all this. But then, despite all these devastating effects of climate change on women, we know that the role of women in climate change adaptation and mitigation is very key. We can't put them aside. And Nath has given us all the statistics that if we put women at the center of this, the changes that we are likely to see, if we put women at the center of it. But they remain an untapped resource when we talk about climate change and mitigating climate change and the solutions for that. And it's important to understand where they are at, because for us to make, for us to face the future more effectively, governments and policymakers now need to begin to include women in these discussions around policy changes regarding climate change mitigation and adaptations, because they are a huge resource that are yet to be tapped. They know the modifications to make. They're the ones that use fuel to prepare food. They know if there is no stick today, what can I change into? They know the adaptations to make. But because those capacities, their capacities are not built, the knowledge is not there, and they remain excluded from the discussions around, these negotiations around climate change adaptations, it's difficult to then, tap from that huge resource that is available within them. We're told that an IUCN tells us that the national focal points of the global environmental facility is made up of less than 30% of women. So people who sit around the table to talk about climate change, to talk about environmental changes, women are not there. Most of them are men. And they are the ones that are bearing the brunt. And so they don't have a voice in this decision making. And so if we really are going to go forward, in these climate change discussions, I think we need to go back, to including the most affected population at the table, so that they are sitting around the table and they're lending a voice to the discussion, and they're also part of that decision making. There must be a real push, to develop these gender action climate plans where women are put in the center of it so that they can think about what the actions they need to take, the changes they need to make, and how to implement those actions. And until we start doing that, it's going to be difficult to really say we are going to make progress in terms of climatic changes. I hope I've been able to answer your question.
Well, absolutely, Dr. Olusola. I think you spoke about a lot of aspects that are contributing factors which can actually lead to upliftment of, let's say, half of the population, because women consists of that, which is why I would like to now also get in Dr. Norma Patricia, who is a renowned biologist with a PhD in biological oceanography and marine biochemistry as specialist. Dr. Norma, very welcome. I have another question now that we're talking about climate change and environmental impact. How do you think, with your experience, how can gender mainstreaming be a game changer for coastal regeneration, food security, and poverty?
Well, thank you so much, REETIKA. I think that everything that I heard until now, well, my colleagues, they are right. What I think is education is the basis of everything. We have very big difference between the urban areas and the rural areas, at least in Mexico, and I think that is the same in our countries. And what we are facing now is that women, they have less opportunities, they have more work at home, and they have a lot of problems with the family, facing situations like the pandemic or other situations like a climate change, poverty. How we can work on this issue? I think that is, if I see the fields in Mexico, in the north of Mexico, women are not working in the fields. They are not involved in agriculture tasks. That is a very technical issue in the north of Mexico. Then you don't need to be there as a woman, but you work together sometimes with kids because they are coming, they have a migrations from the south of Mexico to the north. And then the problem starts when kids and women are working, harvesting the fields. That is a big problem, not the task as agriculture working on the fields. Then the poverty in our country, we say that we have a food security. The food is not well distributed in all the country. I think that we need to work on that issue because you have a very poor areas in the rural countryside, and others you have in the urban areas, people that is wasting a lot of food. That is well known. And I think that we need to work in this to provide everybody what they need. Because in the fields, in the rural areas, you have the opportunity to produce your own food, but people has no education. That is a big problem. And for me, education is the basis. The work opportunities, to share everything, all the activities that you can share at home, you can share outside. And when we talk about sustainable development, we need to talk and we need to think that every one of us has something to do. Every single person has a part that needs to be taken to understand that sustainable development without everybody that is not working together, you cannot achieve. Every single of the ODS, the sustainable goals, you cannot achieve without a collaboration, without every single person inside. Then for me, it's very simple. If I work on education, for me to give education to everyone is the key. For me, is the key. No other thing, because you can achieve everything what you need through the education. And I think that in not every country you have the same level of education, especially because you don't have the schools, or schools are very far away from the small towns and you need to walk for kilometers, kids in the middle of nowhere, and I think that is important. That is my vision, working on research and working on education that should be achieved And yeah, the problem with women and men is also a problem in Mexico, but it's mostly in the rural areas than urban areas, because now women are working at least in a population where you have 50-50 men and women. I can say that in urban areas, at least in my surrounding, 60-70% of women are working. And that makes a difference.
Well, definitely. Absolutely, Dr. Norma. Because we understand, that inclusion of everybody is very important. And as you correctly pointed out, just knowing about it will not do the thing. You have to be responsible. You have to accept that I myself am going to try and bring the change, which gets me to introduce our next professional as well, who is in fact multidisciplinary professional who has more than 16 years of experience in policy research, advocacy, and capacity building on sustainable development and climate change, Ms. Shailly Kedia. Ms. Shailly, is it true that women don't have the same rights as men in many of the nations? However, where they do have, how much do you think are self-limiting beliefs in women on global level responsible for the gender equality gap that has formed over so many years?
Thank you for, firstly, thank you to the organizers and thank you to the previous speakers. It's been very insightful listening to your discussions. Yes, I mean, in terms of gender inequality, when we look at the grassroots level, firstly, we see that women have actually led a lot of environmental movements, whether it's in India or even in Africa. Take the case of Wangari Maathai in the Green Belt movement. Women have been key to so many environmental movements that have emanated at the local level. But then what has gone wrong at the global level? So the thing about global level is we really see a reflection of the political economy aspects, which is highly masculine and patriarchal. By political economy aspect, we look at the business, the corporate sector, which is still very male dominated. We look at the larger governance and institutional structure, which is very male dominated across the world. And that is what reflects, especially and for me, I come mostly from a global environmental lens and filter. I'm not really talking so much about other aspects of sustainable development. When we look at the climate change response institutions at the national level, look at the, from my own country, India, what is the representation of a woman in these major national level climate councils? It's very unequal. And this is what reflects, I mean, at the end, what forms the global discourse on climate change or response to climate change is basically a sum from national levels. It's not really coming from the grassroots. And that is clearly reflecting that it is not really an individual self-limiting belief, but rather what is reinforced by institutional aspects. Thank you.
Very true, Shailly. And this gets me to introduce and welcome our iconic youth leader, a global influencer, an environmentalist, founder, president of Green Hope Foundation, Ms. Kehkashan Basu. Very welcome, Kehkashan. As Ms. Shailly stated, there is an in-depth, or there is a belief system, there is a patriarchal society, which will make sure that the kind of opposing beliefs, if you have, then you have to, really shut it down. Which is why I would like to ask you now, since you've been working for so many years and you are in fact a youth icon, what are your views about the developing countries who are implementing policies and programs, that make the role of women substantial in the society? Do you think, this particular step will actually get them closer to being a developed country as compared to those who haven't as yet? Do you think it's a big step?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'd just like to begin by saying that, we know that women's rights equate to human rights. And as we are one half of humanity, and yet, as all my fellow panelists have stated, we face challenges and adversities and bias from literally womb to tomb. And the Universal Declaration on Human Rights that was adopted by the UN 7 decades ago remains the most compelling document that's agreed upon by all countries and peoples on the value and sanctity of human rights. And in its preamble, it calls for the recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family as the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And this proclaims without any ambiguity the equality of all humans, irrespective of gender. But the very next article, Article 1, states that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Now, I ask you, why not sisterhood? Or better yet, why not do away with the gender binary in itself? Maybe it's because this document was framed by leaders who were almost all men, and these nuances are not important for them to consider, but it is still deeply ingrained in these inequalities in every aspect of our daily life, and that forms the root of gender inequality. So to answer your question, women's development equates to the nation's development, and countries that lag in this aspect will continue to suffer from polarization, lopsided, unequal growth, and will fall behind. And especially in the current scenario when especially developing nations have been hit so hard by the pandemic, this has just been exacerbated. And on top of all of that, we have to deal with climate change-induced disasters and a host of other issues. So we have to ensure, and again, reiterating what my fellow panelists have said, we need the recovery policies to be people-centric, based on equity, and without bias based on gender. And here I'm not just talking about the countries we typically see as developing. The nations even we see as developed or labeled as developed, they are also severely lacking in gender equality in many contexts. I mean, look at what's happening in the US right now. There's a severe regression of women's rights. So no country can be seen as developed unless gender equality is achieved, and not just based on the GDP, but actual human development. And the recent OECD report has painted a dire scenario that if recovery mechanisms do not strengthen vulnerable segments of civil society first, we not have development, and that includes specific focus on gender-centric resilience building. So nations now have an opportunity to build a new normal, and that is only possible if the progress is centered on bridging the gender gap.
Well, very true, Kehkashan. And, as Emma Watson also stated in one of her recent interviews, it's time that we actually perceive gender on a spectrum and not as two opposite sides of, as idols. So I would like to get in Miss Shailly Kedia again. And, Shailly, help us elaborate as to what impact can actually men make in the area of gender equality. We are talking about men, they should be coming in and, joining the forces. What impact can they actually make to this entire fight of gender equality? Shailly, are you there?
I'm here. Yeah. Firstly, the most important thing that men can do is to really acknowledge that there is a disparity, there is an inequality, there are inequities when it comes to gender questions. They have to acknowledge that they have been born into a society which is patriarchal, which privileges men, and they have earned a certain privilege because of the way the society is. So first step really is to acknowledge that for men to acknowledge that there is a problem. And of course, like other movements go, they have to show solidarity and also take action and challenge current societal, not just societal, but also political economic structures, which are where the power is centered more around the male gender. So yes, this is what I think the men can do. But finally, I would also like to add that patriarchy should not be conflated with masculinity. So patriarchal structures can involve women too. And so those also need to be challenged. Thank you.
Absolutely, Shailly. And it also makes sense, while now there are so many organizations working towards it, so many corporates working towards it, that male leaders need to realize that there is, in fact, a lack of women in the, in the workforce. That lack of women has to be realized by them. And I would also like to now get in Dr. Olusola. Dr. Olusola, you have worked quite much at the grassroots level, and one of the principles that you have advocated for is that education of women is very essential to improving global public health. Now, please enlighten us as to why is this relationship so important, and how can education of women be prioritized across the globe?
Thank you very much, Rikita. Yes, I agree. And it's been established that when you educate a woman, you don't just educate that woman, you educate a nation. And so there's evidence to show that when women are educated, it improves the health outcomes of their children. And that's established globally. Every child that has one disease or the other, underlying that disease is usually malnutrition. 50% of children with pneumonia, diarrhea, or even malaria have malnutrition as an underlying condition in those children. And one of the key drivers of malnutrition is actually ignorance. And we know that the women are the first port of call when it comes to raising a child. And so when a woman is not educated, every woman is passionate about her child and would go to any length to ensure that her child survives. But when a woman doesn't know the right combination of food to give her child, it leaves her vulnerable and leaves her child also vulnerable. And so educating women is critical if we are going to achieve the health goals that are related to child survival and every other health goal that are related to the thriving, not just the survival of the child, but also ensuring that the child thrives. And so we can't underestimate the importance of educating women. We cannot underestimate that. Globally, there's about three quarter of annual neonatal deaths toll is avoidable, according to the World Bank, simply by educating young girls who will be mothers. So if you educate young girls, you are likely to avert 3/4 of neonatal deaths. And so that's massive, it's huge in terms of impact. And so when we educate a child, a girl child, you are not just educating that child, you're educating a generation, because an educated woman will ensure that her own children are also educated, because she has now learned to see the benefits of education in her own life. So she's going to fight to ensure that her own child is also educated. And so how do we encourage people to focus on this? That's the second part of your question.
Yes.
And I think the first step is that all of us need to, first of all, agree or address these social norms that are against the education of the girl child. In most African settings, I don't know whether, it's similar across the globe, but because I'm from Africa, I'm more familiar with that setting. There's this societal norm and this belief that a girl child does not need to be educated because she ends in the kitchen. And that, you waste your money when you send her to school because she's going to end up in a man's house anyway, and she's not going to be any good. And so they tend to isolate the girl child and focus on the boy children, and tend to, prioritize the education of the boy over the girl. If we continue that way, there is no way we're going to meet the SDGs that we're talking about, because it takes an educated woman to be empowered. Education is a key to empowerment. That's the first thing that gets a woman empowered. Once you have knowledge about something, you have the ability to do and to take the right decision about those things, decisions that are backed with knowledge. And so it's critical that, first of all, we need to address these social norms. Our social norms must change if we're going to get women to be educated. And we must also overcome the stereotypes, in our society, so that we can create an enabling environment for girls to thrive. Oh, there are certain courses that are meant for boys. Boys are better. Sciences, for instance, are meant for boys because they are more brilliant. And so they tend to shift the girls away from, sciences, and then say, okay, you can just take these softer courses because they are easier, just you can go into teaching, you can go into nursing and things like that. And then the mathematical things, you say, oh no, this is for boys. Those kind of things, they tend to discourage girls from, maximizing their potentials and really pursuing their dreams. Now, I also think that we need to start from the family, because every girl child, their first contact is with their family. And it's the outcome of every child, and whether a child will be educated also depends on the perception of the family into which that child is born. If the perception of the family doesn't change, and it still aligns with societal norms that are contrary to education of girl children, then we're going to keep perpetuating illiterate women and illiterate girls. So I think families also need to, we need to start that change from the family, so that they allow the girl child to make a decision without any prejudice whatsoever about what they can do in terms of the choices they can make in terms of career, or even in terms of, the kind of education that they need to get. And then governments and private organizations, non-governmental organizations, everyone actually needs to encourage girls to be educated. That we need to encourage them. And one way to do that is that when we see girls that are promising, and I know NGOs that do that a lot, they go into the grassroots and you see girls that are very intelligent girls playing on the street, but then you gather them into a class and you give them some tasks to do, and you see how intelligent these girls are, that if you would just put them in school, you'll be amazed the kind of product you're going to get out of them. And so it's important that all of us put our hands on the deck. Whatever we can do, where we can give bursaries and scholarships to those girls that are promising, but they don't have the wherewithal to go to school, it's important to do that. And also, even at the policy level, we can also begin to give give a higher quota, for instance, to girls in terms of admissions into higher institutions or admissions into school, because we already know that there's a gap anyway between the boys and the girls. And so we need to, give some advantage to some extent, give a quota, enlarge the quota for girls and say, okay, we will employ, 70% for girls in terms of admission, in order to at least close that gap that is already created in the system. So I think, it's a multi-pronged approach, and also a multi-stakeholder approach that's going to help us to really get to where we like to go in terms of girl child education. Thank you.
Very true, Dr. Olusola. And from this, I think a good takeaway is you have to grab it with both hands and all the fingers for it to be substantial, for it to be, getting into the mainstream. And very rightly, you pointed out, education is very essential for empowerment. If there is education, only then there is empowerment. So I would like to ask now Dr. Norma as well. Dr. Norma, there have been a lot of news surrounding the calamities that have been happening all over the world, especially the Antarctic glaciers that we all know. And so many other anthropological disasters in the past decades. How do you think, Dr. Norma, our audience today, can bring a change to ensure that at least their contribution to the sustainable development and empowerment of women please help us with some steps or with some ways which our audience today or people who will be listening to us later on can adapt to those ways that can help them contribute to sustainable development and empowerment of women.
Okay, thank you, Ritika. I think that, like I said before, and that in the same way that Olusola said it now, education and knowledge is very important. But what I think is that we need to educate everybody. We need to educate women and men in the same way, at the same level. Because for me to educate women without a man, there is no change. If the man doesn't understand that they need to change towards women, that is very difficult. Then to go to the sustainable development, we need to go, like I said, together in the same path, in the same way, with the same level of education and with the same level of knowledge, because we need to understand that we are, if we don't understand that we are part of the problem, we will be never part of the solution. And that is very simple, because when you ask, to somebody else, do you think that you are a problem, you are working very bad towards the environment, they will say, me, no, it's the others, the country, the state, you see? Then we need to recognize yourself that you are a part of the problem to be a part of the solution. And that will be only with knowledge. You need to know exactly what is going on, not to go to the fake news, not to go to be there, to look at the problems, and then you will be a part of that solution. It's very simple. For me, education is the whole issue, but not women or men, all together in the same way, in the same path, because will not work in another way. If I educate women and men still the same, that is a very big problem. I understand that you have very big difference between regions, between countries, and different levels of cultural education. But we need to work together as a whole, as a world, all together to try to understand and to help each other in every country, looking within the difference that we have in every way. Thank you so much.
Very true, Dr. Norma. It's about acceptability. It's about being in the present and realizing that there is in fact a crisis and acknowledging that. I think all our panelists today focused on the fact that acknowledging a problem is the first step, towards the solution. And I would now also like to get Kehkashan inside, because she is a youth icon and she has a lot of experience. Kehkashan, how has your humanitarian work changed your outlook of the world? And in fact, what advice would you give to the younger generation who want to follow similar footsteps and make a difference as a global citizen?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I started my work in the field of sustainability when I was 7 years old, and I founded Green Hope Foundation on my return from Rio Plus 20 in Brazil as a 12-year-old. And I never actually imagined that in a short span of time, it would evolve into a global change-making movement with a presence in 25 countries. And it's really been an amazingly fulfilling experience to be able to make a difference in someone's life. And that is what allows us, myself and my Green Hope team, to move ahead and surmount the numerous obstacles that we face, from resource constraints to adult cynicism to harassment by older youth, cyberbullying, death threats, stalking, threats of physical abuse, because we work in extremely vulnerable communities tackling issues of trafficking, violence against women. And I would say that I'm one of the privileged few in this world because I have access to education, a loving family, a warm home, and I do not have to worry about my next meal. But when I started facing those challenges at such a young age, I realized that there are millions of others who do not have either or all of these. So my upbringing enabled me to realize how fortunate and I am, and instilled in me the sense of responsibility towards working for others. And our work is children and youth centric. And again, just reiterating, education is the key to driving that awareness in young people. And that is my mantra and my advice to the younger generations who want to make a difference is to take that first step, that every action is important and it counts. Start within your zone of influence and be honest in what you do, because once you do, results will follow. And the challenges that face us as we now still struggle to contain the pandemic are unimaginably severe. But for us to overcome the odds and change the narrative, we need greater participation, involvement, engagement. We need commitment makers amongst young people, catalysts who will motivate and mobilize more young people to join the movements for equality and take it forward, reaching out to those who are the farthest first. And every single one of us, we have it in us. It's not only UN processes or other institutions. Every single institution, community, social enterprise, formal and informal, can and should join this movement and commit to drive the change. And you can take on many forms, whether it's advocacy, financing, policy, or any form of pragmatic commitment. And the key thing to ensure is that they are benefiting the people who are the farthest first, and to ensure that no one is left behind. And I think that there's no better time to start than today. So that will be my final piece of advice to anyone.
That is wonderful, Kehkashan. I think to put it into simple words, small little steps can actually lead to greater changes. So all we need to do is take that one step towards the nature, towards the improvement, towards the empowerment. And it would be in no time that we'll have actually, not discussion of this topic, women empowerment, because we'll be so empowered that, we'll have to not discuss this anymore. So, I also understand the implications of, as we all our panelists discussed today, the implications of not providing women with equal voices, choices, and opportunities. It does not affect their lives, but the future of the planet. And efforts to promote, inclusive, sustainable development and fighting climate change they are inextricably linked together. So if we care about development, we must care also about the consequences. And if we do not take urgent actions, then we will, do such irreparable damage to the national system on which actually life depends on. And all countries, whether it's developed or developing, they have a very important role to play in ensuring a stable world for the generations to come. And today has been an opportunity to reflect and gauge the progress and the ways to make advances in the terms of gender equality and women empowerment, and to look forward more what we need to do now more than ever in the wake of the pandemic and the increasingly devastating consequences of climate change and biodiversity loss on women and communities. We must continue small, little, or bigger, efforts. And now I would, I would like to invite now Dr. Saroj Pachauri to give us her, knowledge, her experience, and her expertise on this entire topic that we are discussing today. So as a public health physician, Dr. Saroj has been extensively engaged with the research on family planning, maternal and child health, sexual and reproductive health and rights, HIV and AIDS, and poverty, gender, and youth. In 1996, she joined as a regional director, South and East Asia Population Council, and established its first regional office in New Delhi, which she managed till 2014. In 2011, she was awarded the prestigious title of Distinguished Scholar and honorarily bestowed. And she has worked with the Ford Foundation's New Delhi office, International Fertility Research Program, the Indian Fertility Research Program, and she has also been a faculty of the Departments of Preventive and Social Medicine at the Lady Hardinge Medical College, New Delhi, and the Institute of Medicine Sciences, Varanasi, where she has helped to develop this new discipline. Dr. Saroj also has published 5 books and contributed chapters to over 20 books. She has over 100 publications in peer-reviewed journals and several articles in the print media. Dr. Saroj, very warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much for this very elaborate and undeserving introduction. Well, let me say that it's been a real pleasure to attend this session. And I would like to congratulate all the panelists and also the POP movement people, because to put this issue on the agenda for the POP movement in the first place is extraordinary and a very welcome step, because we need to have this agenda on every possible forum for it to move forward. Sustainable development cannot possibly happen unless we are focusing on issues of gender equality. SDG 5. If we're talking about SDG 5, which is gender equality, gender empowerment, it cuts across all of the SDGs actually. So when it cuts across all of the SDGs, it's very clear that we sort of fundamental to development, to sustainable development. I am very impressed with the presentations today. They were beautiful, passionate voices I heard, and people who have evidently spent their lives in this area, as we all have. They came from different parts of the world. We learned from Nigeria, we learned from India, we learned from Mexico, we learned from global experiences, and all of them have made very passionate pleas towards the same purpose, that unless and until we can bridge the gender gap, we are not going to be able to move forward in achieving the goals that we intend to achieve anyway. So therefore, it has to be integrated with all of our work, with all of our programs at all levels of the systems in order for that to happen. So right from the grassroots, where women are working, women's voices have to be carried forward to the policy level. As someone said, you have to have women's voices heard across the table. They have to be at the table. If you are going to make a difference in policies, that's the only way to go. And we have been able to do it. Actually, we have succeeded in many areas in being able to do it. From my own word in sexual and reproductive health, there's a book that I wrote called Listening to Women Talk About the Health Issues and Evidence from India. In that, the whole purpose was to get these women who are the poorest of the poor in the villages of India, in the tribal areas, in the poorest communities, to learn about their own health issues, to talk about their own health issues. What are their perspectives? What happens? How do they treat themselves? How do they get treatment? How can they prevent illness? And then these voices were eventually taken across to the policy level. For women's voices have to be heard. Unless your voices are heard, you're not going to be able to make a difference, because people who were there, as many said, largely men. And if there are largely men at the table, the discussion is going to be definitely taken on different tenor. So this is one issue which is very clear. The other thing that we talked about was education. Clearly, education is key. I think there was a consensus around the table that education is key. Without education, women's education, girls' education, everything else cannot happen. And this is a fundamental effort that has to be made across countries to bridge the gap in terms of the education of women and men, and boys and girls. And a great deal has been said about education. I don't think we need to elaborate on that, but it is a critical, important issue that all of us believe in. We talked about a large number of issues in this panel. We talked about agriculture, we talked about food security, we talked about health, we talked about public health, we talked about the power differentials, we talked about men. We talked about the roles of men to a degree. But I think this is something that I would like to emphasize, and we have learned in our own work in sexual and reproductive health, that unless men are involved, we cannot make the difference. Women alone are not going to be able to make the difference. We have to get the participation of men in this process. And in the case of health, for example, in sexual health, we talk of men as husbands, fathers, and partners. And unless there's involvement of men in all of these areas, we are not going to be able to achieve the objectives of improving sexual health, or of reproductive health, or health in general. And I think this is true across the board. It's true not just of health, it is true everywhere. And the last thing I would say is that I wish there had been a man on this panel. I think if there had been a gender-sensitive man on this panel talking from the male perspective, the dynamics of the conversation would have been different. And I know it's extremely difficult to find such men. I've been looking high and low for them myself. But there are a few. There's a guy sitting next to me, for example, who I would say certainly one of them, but there are a few. And I think we should, in future, when we organize these discussions, try to get some men, even if it's only one man in the panel, it will make all the difference. Thank you.
Indeed, Dr. Saroj, thank you so much for enlightening us today with your knowledge and experience. And as you correctly pointed out, we do have a man on our panel today. And I would request Dr. Ash to please help us with your comments, with your experience. And must we say, we truly appreciate you being one of those few men who have actually taken an initiative of bringing this out in the front and discussing it with us today. Dr. Ash.
Thank you so much. Yes, I do agree. It's important to have voices and of men as well. And I think there's another very important point which you flagged, which is that gender is really a spectrum, right? So I think the more diversity we have, the more embracing we are of that diversity, I hope. And it is indeed, I think, something that's very, very important. I can only just say that, with the pop movement, we are driven by a lot of women leaders. There are just a lot of women leaders in the pop movement. And so I hope all the men in the pop movement are inspired and learn and also get that education, which we talked about, which is so important, from women. And I just want to say that, this is such an important subject. And I don't think that we can get done talking about this enough. I think the only thing that I would say we need to do much more of is to bring the issue of gender into all our discussions, not just a specific gender discussion, but we really need to, if we want to integrate it and we want to really mainstream this issue, then the issue of gender needs to be part of all of our discussions. And I hope that in the future and even now as we speak, for all the discussions that we have going forward, again, I don't think we can get anywhere near spelling the word sustainable development or sustainability if we don't really, truly, not just tokenistically, embrace this issue and also practice it. And I know that the issue of education and inclusiveness has come up over and over in the course of our discussion, but this needs to cut across all geographies, all classes, all spaces, all places, and really every single issue that we talk about, because otherwise we're not getting anywhere near doing this. We can kid ourselves, but it's not going to happen. So I just want to say that I'm really grateful for we are guided by the love and the light of amazing leaders who are here with us right now. And I'll only just say that I hope we'll have the blessings that we need to be able to bring this topic, this issue, and this matter, which is the heart of everything, to the heart of everything of what we do and the core of it. So just to say thank you, and we continue to remain inspired, and we need to do this with every bit of our being from this moment on, before, during, and after. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ash. That means a lot to us. And in fact, you are very correct in this, saying that we have such great mentors today who are actually the guiding light for us. And it's very important, especially for the younger generation, to, get into such kind of discussions and, be a part of this entire, structure of organizations and policies and programs, because they are the ones who are going to be, staying here. They are the ones who will be facing it next. So why not join hands with us while we are, working so hard towards it, so that it becomes little easier later on. And, with that, I would like to invite all our panelists for a few more questions that we have from our lovely audience. And, the panel is absolutely open. So anybody who would like to start can do so. This is a quick question about the data. When we talk about sustainable development, I think understanding data for women, those who are getting educated or not, or the ones which are, suffering, that data is very important for, global level. And in 21st century, where data is the key to everything, whether it's success or whether it's success of a nation, of a program, of anything, data is very important. So we need to understand, and in fact, here is the question: why is there a gap in the statistics, and how do you panelists today think that this can be resolved?
I can start by answering that.
Sure.
I think that is a really important question. And, just to elaborate on the data gap that is currently there right now, that there are 13%, only 13% of the world's countries actually dedicate a budget to gender statistics. And I think 85% of countries do not even have laws that mandate gender-based surveys. And to top it all off, almost 60%, that's like 3/5 of the world's nations, do not even produce or publish data again about violence against women. So basically, our problems and issues continue to stay hidden, brushed under the carpet, and forgotten. Now, as a grassroots activist and someone who's been working for such a long time with the very communities that are affected, marginalized women and girls across different countries, I have seen those data gaps firsthand, whether it's in homes for HIV positive children in Nepal, or the facility in Kenya for children of prisoners, or in rural Bangladesh, where women are forced to manage their household finances in addition to the other duties. And now during COVID, we've witnessed an exponential surge in child marriages and trafficking of the girls in these rural communities. But none of this is reported. And I actually, a few weeks ago, saw a UNICEF report that stated that there's been a drastic decrease in child marriage. But I know for a fact that isn't true, because we work in those very communities where there's been a drastic increase in child marriage. So what I would say that it really depends on us as civil society actors as well to highlight these challenges and aggregate statistics. And that's what Green Hope Foundation continually highlights, is that the need for disaggregated data based on our lived experiences and so many other social determinants. And I think understanding the validity as well of citizen generated data and the data that really comes up from the ground, rather than just the top-down approach that a lot of nations still adhere to, and even apex institutions. So I think that is really important to address, and I think that would be the first step in trying to close the data gap, is actually listening to the people who really work on the ground and seeing their data as valid, because that's what we see firsthand, and it's based on our lived experiences. And once we do that, I'm sure that we can move ahead.
Absolutely, Kehkashan. I think that's very insightful, and that allows a lot of us to understand why there is a gap, first of all, the gender gap, exactly. It's all in the data. We get the correct kind of data. It's easier for governments and organizations to implement, to see what has been the impact of the implementation and what else needs to be done. So data is, in fact, a very important key. Kehkashan, thank you so much. I have got a question here for Dr. Madhu from one of our audience members, Alexia, who says, what is your opinion, Dr. Nath, about gender abolition and the radical theory?
Could you just explain the question a little bit more?
Sure. So the audience member has asked, what is your opinion about gender abolition and the radical theory?
Gender abolition, can you talk a little bit more about it? In which way?
Well, I think what he meant here is in case if we are in case of a favoritism, or if, we remove the fact that there has to be a gender categorization, and that in relation to probably the radical theory. I think that's what you meant, Alexia.
Yeah, that's why.
Thank you so much.
Gender abolition and the radical theory. I'm still not clear, Alexia. Can you talk a little bit more?
Yeah, well, I'm asking your opinion of, there's a base of radical theory that says that the real problem, the root of gender inequality is the gender itself. We got the sex of women, like our body, and there is the idea of what a woman is of the society. So,
okay.
Yeah, it's...
Yeah, absolutely. There is a lot of unlearning to be done in the area of gender. And let's begin with hegemonic masculinity. What makes a man and what makes a woman? And unless we invest our efforts in unlearning this, for example, hegemonic masculinity can be today replaced with multiple masculinities. There are ways and ways in which you can be masculine. It's not one particular way. And I think it is a political process. We have spoken a lot about education today, but what kind of education we are talking of really has to begin in the minds, the beliefs about himself or herself, the awareness about the socio-political forces that at times promote gender. So I think the education itself has to go much deeper, and the present kind of education is not enough to eliminate some of these theories.
I hope that answer helped you, Alexia. I have a quick question here from Reva too. Reva, are you here?
Yes, ma'am. So first of all, I would like to thank all of the panelists for that wonderful session and that insight over the topics from different perspectives. I had a question regarding some statistics that state that the countries with female leaders tend to have lower COVID death rates during the pandemic and had a better economic performance. So countries like New Zealand, Denmark, Norway, or Switzerland, compared to the countries that were where the leaders were male or men. So I would like to ask the panelists to put their points of views and their inputs regarding this issue.
Very wonderful question, Reva. Okay, so I'll just reiterate the question a little bit. We have a lot of statistics showing, that women leaders, the countries which had women leaders, they have a lot more stability in terms of the governance, the economical development, and what more impact, and in fact, what should be the learning of other countries that do not have such participation from women, especially in the parliaments or in the decision making. Could this be an eye opener for them? Should this be rather?
Yeah, can I go? This is Shailly here. So, yeah, on Reva's question, which is a good question. Even in India, there are micro studies on women leadership, which show where women are panchayat heads or are heads at the local level. Some of the environmental indicators are much better. So I mean, I will definitely not say with surety, but I would definitely state the fact that more studies are needed and more understanding is needed on this. Coming also to the question on statistics, even when we look at the global indicator framework on SDGs, and we look at it from the lens of climate change environment, one of the glaring gaps is also on environmental aspects. There is not a lot of indicators that are gender disaggregated. So that is also another gap that needs to be filled, for which countries have to invest in better data systems. But I think that question is very good. But I would just like to just highlight that there are studies in India which also show that at the micro level, at least when it comes to environmental performance, some of the panchayats tend to perform better when they have women leaders. So, but I think there are more studies that's needed, and there could be other variables, including the country size, population, etc. But I would also like to leave it here for now. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Shailly. I would also like to have Dr. Pachauri's comment on this.
Well, it's a fact, and it's a lovely fact, that a country like New Zealand has been it's a model. It's something that we all would love to emulate, and it's something that has not happened anywhere else, actually. And it is also true that it has a woman as a prime minister who has tackled a number of very, very serious calamities in her country over the period that she's been there. The most recent being, of course, the COVID pandemic. And the interesting thing is that in the case of the COVID pandemic, for example, she especially in the earlier part of the pandemic, when there was a real concern, she would have meetings every morning, press meetings, and would make statements. And every single person in that country followed them. There was no questioning it. There was complete trust. There was complete and total trust in what she was saying. And in fact, everything that she said became then sort of a thing that everybody repeated, because they believed so deeply in it. So this is in my mind, a very exceptional situation. I don't think there's any other country that I can think of which can reach that level. And I think there's a lot to learn. We recently, Ash and I, wrote a book on COVID, and we took out some of the examples of success stories from around the world. And clearly this was one of them. But I think what has happened is that while there were successes in many countries in Asia, at the time when we wrote the book, which has been some months ago, there has been a resurgence of the pandemic in those very countries, in Taiwan, in South Korea, in Indonesia, in Vietnam, etc. But New Zealand is one, and even in Australia. But in Vietnam New Zealand is one country which has been able to sustain the process. So there is something very special going on there. And I think there's a very special woman that's doing it.
Indeed, Dr. Saroj, I think that's one case study we all over the world should try to replicate. I would also like to get Dr. Norma onto this question. Dr. Norma, what are your comments with your experiences?
Well, my experience is that in Mexico, more and more we are having women working in all fields. And I can tell you that in environmental issues, we are more women than men, of course. And we have a very strong groups from women. In Mexico, we have more or less 90 networks working in all fields. And 70% of those networks are coordinated by women. Then the women is taking a very high position. And in my case, I coordinate the environmental network, ocean, climate, and global change. And I can tell you that in my institution, in some fields, even engineering now, we have more women than men. That is the point. Yeah, we are taking a lot of positions as a women group in Mexico.
Well, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great, Dr. Norma. And with that, we have so many prominent women leaders here, and it'll be unfair to leave out everybody. So I'm going to get Dr. Miss Nath also onto this question with her experience and with her knowledge. Miss Nath, what comments do you have onto this question?
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes. You're very audible, Miss Nath.
Okay. We, as was remarked earlier, we really need some more data, because even as a gender activist, I have felt that there have been men who have taken gender sensitive decisions and performed at times equally well. And let me just take you to Singapore, where I am stationed at the moment. This is a country led by a man, and it has been able to take the issue of COVID to a large extent quite successfully. The point is, and frankly, as working on the gender issue for so many years, we worry at times when people just judge the status of gender in the country by the fact that there's a woman leader. So I think let's sort of discuss this issue a little bit more when we have more data, as somebody remarked earlier, because just a woman's leadership may or may not be enough to say that there has been success in a particular area. So I'm of a firm belief that we have had gender sensitive decisions, priority decisions can be taken by men and by women, depending on the environment in which they have. It's not, and at times you have a number of women in polity, but that doesn't translate essentially into distributive justice. So I'll just say this on a note of caution.
Well, very insightful, Ms. Nath. Thank you so much. And yes, the caution has to be kept in mind. Now, this also gets me quickly to Kehkashan, because she has to leave with an emergency. Kehkashan, your comments on this question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, first of all, I don't see this as an issue at all, that the fact that women leaders have been able to make so much progress in such a short period of time, but just being able to handle their countries so well. And I would also say that, yes, any person, regardless of their gender, who is committed to gender equality, would be able to make the decisions that are, that have gender that's at the core of all of their decision making. We have seen, historically, and even in the current context, that has primarily been women and non-binary folks. But at the same time, it is possible for men to do it as well, and we've seen that in our work too. So I do have to leave, but very quickly, just to say that yes, every single person has that in them to take that first step towards gender equality. And once we do that, I think that we all would be able to consider ourselves to be feminists and create a gender equal.
Well, absolutely, Kehkashan. Thank you so much for those words with your experience. I think it's lovely to have inputs from all our panelists. I would quickly now request Dr. Olusola for her closing comments on this.
Could I just come in for a minute before we end? I'll just
sure,
take a
Ms. Nath.
second. Yeah, sure. One thing that I think remained a gap in our discussions today was the whole issue of a redefinition of gender as we are moving along. I would like to just put in a small input here, that as time has gone, we are now bringing the gender definition to say that gender is about the power relations between and among men and women. And somehow I think, although it was mentioned about the radical discussion and that choice, we have not invested enough in terms of the whole issue of transgenders, third gender, and whatever, and how do we respect the identity. I just wanted to flag it as an issue that
Well,
we have
absolutely.
and
Well,
we
Ms.
can.
Nath, I think that gender in itself as a subject, it's quite vast. So we will probably, that Dr. Ash had it on his agendas, but since it's such a huge area, and we would love to have one of our sessions wherein we can particularly discuss regarding the gender differentiation and covering all the other genders also. So Ms. Nath, thank you so much for highlighting that. I think we'll keep that in mind for our upcoming sessions. And now coming to Dr. Olusola. Any comments from you, please?
Thank you, Rikita. I think it's been such a very stimulating discussion, and I've really learned a lot from the session. And coming from the perspective of health, and just to also speak to the issue about women making progress with COVID and all that. And I think really I agree with Madam Nath that we need more data, but as we were talking, one report that came to my mind quickly was a WHO report that said we led by men, but like implemented by women or something like that, delivered by women, but led by men. And in that report, they did an analysis of equity, gender equality and all that. And they found out that more than 70% of the global workforce are made of women at the grassroots. They're the one doing it, actually delivering the services, but when it comes to decision-making at the top, at the helm of affairs, it's led by men. But when it comes to delivering health itself, it is the women that are actually doing the work, so we've had a lot of discussion. There is no doubt about the role of women. And I believe that as we, I saw a question in the chat box where somebody was asking that how do we actually mainstream this? How do we get policy makers to incorporate gender and nuances about gender into policy making and policy decision making and all that? And I think, this is one way to do it. Let's get talking about it. And we also need to get involved wherever we are, no matter where we are. Let's get involved in it as women, and also encourage girls to also get involved in the discussions. And then whatever we can do, it's like little drops of water in a bucket. But I believe that as we drop little drops, it will eventually make a big ocean. Thank you so much for this opportunity to participate.
Lovely quote, Dr. Olusola. That's truly sums up exactly what our discussion has been about today. And hail to the women power, hail to all the women who came and joined us here today. Lovely set of panelists with all your experience and your teachings and education. We were in fact quite enlightened, and I hope our audience was too. So thank you so much once again to all our lovely panelists. You took out time, and especially such a hard time here for each and every one of us. So I would request all of you to please take care, please take all the precautions, be healthy, eat healthy, and keep promoting women empowerment.
Thank you so